Allora, continuiamo questa giornata impegnativa con il terzo contributo dal titolo Pratiche di teologia mistica secondo Michel de Certeau, che ci sarà offerto dal professore Inigo Bocken, professore di teologia mistica alla Università Cattolica di Lovagno in Belgio e studioso presso l'Istituto Titus Brandsma per la mistica e la spiritualità dell'Università Radboud nei Paesi Bassi. La sua ricerca si concentra sulla teorizzazione della mistica, sulla storia della teologia mistica e sul rapporto tra mistica, religione e politica nella società moderna. Volentieri lo ascoltiamo. Grazie.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me, and I want to give my congratulations for the organization of this, the perfect organization of this conference. It is spring 1630, perhaps sometime in April, in any case before May 8th, when in a carriage on the way from Rouen to Paris, an encounter takes place that would draw deep forward in the later history of spiritual life. It is the then 30-year-old Jesuit Jean-Joseph Surin who sets out into the wide world, or perhaps the desert, for this is the word that falls in the letter Surin writes shortly after the event, reporting on his miraculous journey, away from the training house in Rouen to unwind after years of bottomless despair. Surin, who at that time already had his entire formation in theology and philosophy behind him, describes in the letter the encounter in the moving vehicle with a young man of perhaps 18 or 19 years of age, as we can read. And again, quotation, extremely simple and unrepentant in language, without any formation, but otherwise so plainly and clearly filled with all possible forms of grace and inner gifts that I had never seen anything so similar. To quote Surin further, he was never taught in the spiritual life by anyone but God himself, and yet he spoke to me so refined and so powerfully that everything I had read and heard about it was nothing compared to what he said about it. End of quote. The encounter with the young man opens up for Surin a perspective that no theology or philosophy has ever offered him. And as I said, it is an encounter that would leave traces in the history of the spiritual life. It was above all Michel de Certeau who brought this event back to life, making it a key moment of the great story of mysticism in the modern age. Less unambiguous is what the stakes of the story are, which is the reality Certeau wants to expose with this key moment. There is a persistent reading that circulates nowadays when Certeau's conception of mysticism is discussed, a reading that I want to question. It boils down to the fact that Michel de Certeau has shown that mysticism has become autonomous from the early modern era onward, appearing for the first time as a noun and thus no longer functioning as an adjective in theology. Certeau would then stand in a tradition that, for example, the Belgian Benedictine theologian Dom François van den Broeke called le divorce entre théologie et mystique many years ago. Mysticism of the 16th, 17th century also appears in this reading, so not mine, as the forerunner of a late modern spirituality discourse centered on a subjective experience in which there is no longer room for theological perspectives. Today I want to read Certeau somewhat different, as an author that opens possibilities to find hidden traces of mystical theological practices, practices offering resistance towards the modern dualism of dominating modern rationality against the background of the Cartesian subject. As a thinker, I want to read him of the relation between theory and practice, contemplation and action. To show that, I want to refer to two string traces that of Ignatian and of Carmelite schools of thought and practices. I think that Certeau rather portrays a history that undermines the myth of the encircling Cartesian subject, and that the history of mystical theology does not end with the installation of the Cartesian subject. Thereby, it is true that Certeau did not get around to describing these modern shortcuts in full because La Fable Mystique remained unfinished. Michel de Certeau points out that Surin's staging in the letter places himself in a larger stream of tradition, dating back to the late Middle Ages and surfacing massively from the 14th century in particular, or to use an image of Certeau's, whose keel water draws the ground line of modern spirituality, end of quote. It is the simple friend of God with Johannes Tauler. It is the laity of the modern devotion in the Netherlands. It is the idiota with Cusanus, the spoon cutter, who far surpasses his interlocutor, a learned philosopher, with insight even when he cannot quote Aristotle. In the times after Surin, the list of examples Certeau describes only grows longer. The peasant girl from Diwa, the poor cow herders from Ponsonat, Barbe from Compiègne also herds cows, to name but a few, with the cultivated one declaring again and again how much he has discovered thanks to them. Even the cannibals from Montaigne's essay of the same name pass by. But who surely is this mysterious figure who wanders throughout the history of modern mysticism in ever-changing guises and further on in time appearing more and more as a poor, propertyless beggar who confronts the theologian with his own not knowing until the days of liberation theology. Almost en passant, Certeau gives something of an answer to this question when he indicates that this figure appears most emphatically and reflexively in the work of Nicholas of Cusa. The idiota, the layman, in other words, a spoon cutter. And it is perhaps also no coincidence that the second volume of La Fable Mystique opens with a lengthy chapter on this mystical theologian from the 15th century, a theologian trying to reform Dionysius' mystical theology. A chapter, by the way, that was already finished at the time of Certeau's death. It seems that it's only against the background of the far from melancholy encounter between the learned philosopher and the simple spoon cutter that Certeau begins to see through the grammar of the speech of this mysterious figure who repeatedly crosses the paths of the mystics. just as this is the case with the young men of Surin. Cusanus' spoon cutter does not reject the theoretical position of the learned philosopher at all. In none of the examples Certeau cites are they played off against each other. Rather, a lively conversation develops in which the spoon cutter recounts his concrete praxis of spoon cutting, the moments of unexpected creativity he encounters in it, and which he interprets as an unexpected presence of God in his own actions. He is not the one who stands above the material and subjects it to his designs, but in his search for the right and appropriated form, his actions are guided by a movement of which he himself is not the author, the desire to make an ever and better form, knowing that it is a never-ending process. The Platonic and Aristotelian categories and schemes with which the learned philosopher comments on the exposition of the Idiota appear in a different light in conversation with the yearning practice of spoon cutting. With Cusanus, the living praxis of the Idiota confronts the theoria of the scholar with the necessity of having to begin again and again in practice. The spoon cutter staged by Nicholas of Cusa mirrors to the scholar philosophy an image in which his own speculative reflections become visible in a new space. The theoria trying to understand God is like a painter trying to paint himself, and in painting, he is trying to depict something of which he himself is part. Even if he succeeded in this, his enterprise has already failed, because this portrait itself is not depicted along with it. This is not a reason for the spoon cutter to give up that attempt, but rather a reason to keep trying. In the failure, it becomes clear that what is depicted is so rich and multifaceted that it can always be depicted better and differently than it is currently depicted. The failing is the succeeding, the not knowing is the knowing. Doing constantly challenges thinking, stays one step ahead of it, but to see through this is precisely the task of the Theoria New Style. To represent the not knowing as the source of creativity, the mirror of practice in which the Theoria finds itself challenged to search further. The Idiota appears in Surin's letter in the form of the young man. And Surin seems to be so aware of this tradition, Certeau says, that he must convince himself of the authenticity of the encounter. That's very interesting that Certeau is saying that. Surin therefore gathers in his letter, Certeau adds, very interesting, I like these kind of in-between sentences, with all the cautious precautions peculiar to the infatuated. Every possible clue that should guarantee the authenticity of the encounter. But he eats anyway, the boy. And this, according to Certeau, almost triumphant exclamation, le garçon s'est découvert plus qu'il n'a pensé. He has opened up more than he thought himself. In other words, Surin is looking for the tangible presence of the gaze that sees him, the word that touches him, an untouchable tangibility then, similar to what is, in Certeau's eyes, the primal experience of Christian faith, and the foundation of the corpus mysticum, the experience of the noli me tangere of Mary of Magdala at the empty tomb, an experience that has also left sophisticated pictorial traces throughout the history of Christianity, as we all know. Untouchable then, because this angel disappears from sight again as unexpectedly as it had come, almost like Walter Benjamin's Angelus Novus, as Certeau adds. It is an angel in the desert, and let us not forget Surin, although a Jesuit, learned to pray among the Carmelites. That is what Certeau stresses, who reveals to him that despair as the not knowing for which he was actively searching. In the encounter with the other, the space arises in which the despairs become the desert, in which Surin's unanswerable longing itself provides the answer to the abyssal search. With this encounter, however, Surin's agony was far from over. Despair would continue to accompany him into old age, taking him through long phases of possession and madness, even to the point of a suicide attempt. Surin's path, his spiritual path, went along the edge of the spiritual abyss, but it was a path where he would overcome despair again and again, and which resulted in some late literary spiritual highlights, such as his Guide spirituel. The encounter with the young man does not end this despair, but it does make it appear in a different perspective. It is no accident that, as Certeau shows, Surin would carry his letter with him for life, referring to it again and again in his subsequent correspondence. For Surin, the written letter becomes the outward sign, the scriptural corpus mysticum, which would remind him again and again of the possibility of transformation, which would find its reflection in his Guide spirituel 30 years after his letter, the moment when he was also freed for good from the delusions that would not let go of him. Spoon cutter, young man, peasant, or cannibal, Certeau shows that it is the gaze of a concrete other in the encounter that brings theory back to life, anchors it in the living reality that is always greater than theory. The idiota, this is not the abstract principle of practice, but she or he is precisely the one who always begins anew, like a true layman, that is an eternal beginner. But especially for the divine, whoever thinks he knows God and everything that can be said about him, and has considered himself as a specialist in the matter, has precisely not understood what mystical theology is all about. The painter who thinks he has been able to painting as such ends up deceiving himself. The pain of the inability to know God transforms into the joy of starting all over again, like Surin, who can start all over again in the face of his interlocutor. In the reference to the figure of the idiota, it becomes clear that something very different is going on here than a closed Cartesian calculating subject crying out his pain because the living word of God has become inaudible in a technocratic world. Similarly, American Catholic theologian Andrew Prevost, in his recent book, The Mysticism of Ordinary Life, sees Certeau more along the lines of mystical theology. For Prevost, too, there is no such thing as a nominalist rupture that alternatively to the domination of the virile organizing Cartesian subject. Prevost reads La Fable Mystique as describing mystical theology against the background of the rise of cities in the Netherlands, for example, and the emancipation of the citizen in modern urban society. The figure of the idiota appears where mystical theology leaves the monastic space and, as for example in the modern devotion, is found rather in the teeming life of the city. There is certainly much to be said about Prévost's own mystical theology, but for now, what is important is that he reads Certeau differently from the dominant interpretation already mentioned, with which I started my lecture, and which decry the fatal crisis of the corpus mysticum, the founding unity of mind and body, of the inner and outer, of the finite and the infinite, a crisis that leads, as it were, necessarily to the Cartesian mastery thinking. But Prévost does not go far enough. He makes it too easy for himself by reading Certeau harmlessly as the historian or sociologist who describes mystical theology in a changing cultural historical situation, modern bourgeois society. But there is something else at play with Certeau, a layer whose scope perhaps he himself had not yet sufficiently grasped, but nevertheless abundantly present. It is the striking presence of Carmelite minds as well as that of Ignatian-oriented figures in La Fable Mystique, two lines that accompany the mystical fable like a basso continuo. By Certeau, they are still described as winding mountain roads, sometimes also subterranean corridors. But too conspicuous are they, these tracks, not to follow them and express a suspicion of where they lead when viewed in their joint courses, the Ignatian and Carmelite line. These schools of thought that cultivate the changing relationship between contemplation and action, teaching them to deal with the always unexpected response to desire. As such, they shape the continuation of the conversation with the idiota as schools in which this conversation is lived, learned, and practiced. I say this not only because La Fable Mystique is teeming with Jesuits and Carmelites. What is particularly interesting is that Certeau repeatedly observes the inimitable interaction between the two lines. Already from his detailed description of the trajectories taken by Surin's letter, it becomes clear that it touched the nerve of his time. We see that when Certeau stresses the fact that Surin learned what praying is from the Carmelites, but the interaction is far more complicated. But we should not forget that also Teresa, even in her most eccentric moments, always kept her gaze fixed at the Jesuit Borgia, her confessor. And in an edition of Certeau, according to the Dutch Carmelite Titus Brandsma, this is my own edition, had become familiar with Tauler's mystical theology through Petrus Canisius, the Jesuit. Sometimes the parties also switch position, as it is clear from those passages in Surin's Guide Spirituel, where he dissociates himself with the harsh critique of the anti-mystical theologian Jean Chéron, a Carmelite, by the way, of mystical discourse and melancholy illusions. The letter's inimitable paths wave a network around Surin's experience, a scriptural corpus mysticum in the middle of which Surin's noli me tangere is hidden. Notable is Certeau's observation that the letter would come to play a central role in the crisis that occurred in the Jesuit order of those days, with several generals forbidding the reading of mystical texts precisely because circles formed that read Teresa of Avila intensively. It is in the circle of those mystical Jesuits that Surin's letter began to circulate, as Certeau's detective work shows. In a sense, what is at stake in this crisis is nothing less than a struggle between a Cartesian disciplining reading of the spiritual exercises and the mystical interpretation of them, oriented to Teresa of Avila. Innumerable in La Fable Mystique are the surprising interactions between the Ignatian and Carmelite schools of thought. But it becomes clear again and again that they are both seeking a new relationship between contemplation and action. We can think of the Contemplativus in Actione and the Carmelite reform spurred by Teresa and John of the Cross, often characterized in terms of contemplatio in actu, the theoria unfolding in the midst of practice. I see in these lines not only expressions of the spiritual life, but on the contrary, an alternative register that developed concretely for centuries, generated patterns of thought, schools, forms of life, forms of science. The crisis in the society of Jesus is nothing less than a conflict between a Cartesian ascetic internalization and self-discipline on the one hand, and the locating of contemplation in the living concrete practice on the other, which challenges contemplation and learns to live with non-knowing. The word of the spoon cutter, the gaze of the young man that transforms despair into not knowing. The dark night that, as this is described with John of the Cross, makes visible precisely the light. One should not get the impression here that the Cartesian spirit manifests itself everywhere and would infect the spiritual traditions. In fact, it is historically more likely that Descartes developed the epistemological reduction of the spiritual exercises in his Méditation métaphysique under the impression of the discussions within the Ignatian school of thought, perhaps from an inability to understand the complexity of the transformative relationship between contemplation and action. For it must be said, this shallow tributary of the Ignatian stream of thought that seeks to expel uncertainty precisely from the praxis of concrete life would not historically be entirely without success. Unlike the angelic appearance of the idiota, the malin génie appears in Descartes' variant of the spiritual exercises as a being in all his deceitfulness, cannot be trusted and must be eliminated with all possible wiles of reason. Against this background, the different variants of the dynamic relationship between contemplation and action are certainly traces of the corpus mysticum as modeled from Dionysius Areopagita. So the break with modernity is not absolute, and perhaps it's only at the beginning of the second volume that Certeau became aware of this. Precisely then when he undertook another reading of Nicholas of Cusa. Although the vision of God was written for monks, it can nevertheless be considered as a writing that, under the influence of the Devotio Moderna, transformed mystical theology of Dionysius against the background of the changing relationship between contemplation and action. Not the cell of the monks is now the space of mystical theology, but the streets and the squares, the place where, according to Cusa, wisdom calls. Against this background, Carmelite and Ignatian practices appear as mystical practices that, despite the crisis of mystical theology, continue even in the modern age, sometimes below the surface. I come to an end. These schools of contemplation and action form the shortcuts of mystical theology into our time. For Certeau, they help to recognize the fragments of the mystical body floating in the sea of secular times as practices of contemplation and action. It seems to me that in the relation of contemplation and action, something becomes visible of what Certeau calls in La faiblesse de croire and in other places la rupture instauratrice. The dynamism so characteristic of Christianity in Certeau's eyes, the irreducible gap between word and deed that shows itself in the most diverse ways, but which, in difference, also shows unity, union dans la différence. As, for example, a theologian like Johannes Hoff rightly shows in one of his studies that Every telling is again a performative act, as it is, for example, in the imitation of Christ, and every time different from the last time, but finds in it precisely its non-articulate unity. The dynamic of difference that is the affirmation of an original unity. In this respect, a variant of mystical theology. This is what Certeau also finds in our secular time, the experience of the excluded other, living on the margins, who in his telling shows the shared space in a new way. Mystical theology along Certeau's lines can no longer start from two firmly defined institutions or codifications, but rather has an eye for these unexpected perspective. Amen.
Grazie di questa incursione nella mistica che ci ha condotto a aprire ulteriori varchi. L'ultimo contributo prima di pranzo, possiamo farcela, resistere ancora un poco, è dal titolo Come pensare teologicamente la nostra pratica. Michel de Certeau e la teologia pratica, ci sarà offerto da Christian Bauer, che è stato professore di teologia pastorale e omiletica presso l'Università di Innsbruck e adesso lavora all'Università di Münster. Dal 2019 è presidente della Società dei Teologi Pastorali di Germania, Austria, Svizzera e Paesi Bassi, e nel 2017 insieme a Marco Sorace ha pubblicato la prima antologia teologica in lingua tedesca su Michel de Certeau. Quindi ci disponiamo ad ascoltarlo e poi avremo ancora un breve spazio di dibattito e poi il pranzo.
So first of all, a big thank you for your kind invitation and for this wonderful conference. In English, there's the wonderful saying, the last one takes the devil. So I hope there is still some energy in the conference and in this aula magna filled with systematic theologians and historians. Let me start with a kind of friendly provocation. Michel de Certeau seems to be a hidden practical theologian, or to use the words of Karl Rahner, an anonymous practical theologian. Practical theology explores the in-between. Margit yesterday mentioned it, the entre-deux, of a wide range of various archives of discourse and fields of practices. Its theological creativity emerges precisely from this characteristic difference. Michel de Certeau traveled the same land, combining a huge variety of discourses and practices in the archives of intellectual production and on the fields of social imagination. He explored the in-between, the entre-deux, of the archives of early modern Christian mysticism, and at the same time, the fields of late modern human existence. Both early modern discourses and late modern practices shape the outlines of his very intellectual profile. His two later masterpieces, Art de faire and La Fable Mystique, both were mentioned several times, represent the potential creativity of this discursive difference. A difference that also is typical for practical theology. Here, two practical discourse of praxistheorie meet discursive practices of theorie-praxis. The explorative and at the same time critical approach of practical theology combines thousands of small stories of everyday life with the great master narratives of the gospel. All this is about Christian contemporaneity. And Michel de Certeau was a master of Christian contemporaneity. Being a true Jesuit on the one hand and a compassionate contemporary on the other, he was at home in the betwixt and between, queering and crossing fascinating worlds of different peoples and places. In my following reflections, I will focus on the post-68 Certeau during the late 1970s, tracing his footprints of those days in 3 steps, to then link them with more recent discourses for actualization. Firstly, a rereading of a little text from 1977 about a seminar held at the Université Parisette à Jussieu, showing the entire Certeau in a nutshell. Secondly, a reflection on 3 very useful distinctions of Michel de Certeau, like watchers and wanderers, strategies and tactics, tours and maps. And thirdly, it's only a short part, I will attempt to shape his heterological approach to mystical discourse and everyday practices as a multifarious discourse on the other. All these things are, even not exclusively, but also necessary for doing practical theology. So, my first step. Comment penser notre pratique? How to think our practice? Michel de Certeau raises this methodologically crucial question in a wonderful, small, more hidden than published text, first printed in the year 1977. Qu'est-ce qu'un séminaire? What is a seminar? By rethinking academic practices epistemically, this article turns the everyday, or better, every second week, practice of a seminar into a source of epistemological creativity. Doing theory by doing seminaries, or more precisely, doing epistemology. That's why this small but important article is more than a mere autoethnographic self-observation of an academic teacher, focused on methodology. It is Michel de Certeau in a nutshell, introducing us into his own style of thinking. I quote, "A seminar is a common research laboratory, un laboratoire commun, that allows each of its participants to express their own insights. It is as if each person brought the dictionary of his or her materials, experiments, and ideas, and as if that laboratory enabled them to form sentences from this vocabulary. This place of exchange that always creates new beginnings, French, échanger instauratrice, could be compared to what is called cactoire, the plural laboratory of a weekly rendezvous on the big square of a city, where passers-by meet to produce a communal language and a personal discourse at the same time." End of quotation. The seminar as a crowded urban square, an academic cactoire where, interwoven into a network of other social places, a communal production of meaning may take place. This production is capable of transforming society by the subversive micro-resistance of late modern arts of living. This was Certeau's main focus in the late 70s when he taught cultural anthropology at the 7th University of Paris in Jussieu. He taught at the, I quote, Cartoire de Parisette from 1972 until 1978, which met brilliantly with his research project on contemporary cultural practices in France, conducted in the years 1974 till 1977. In this empirical teamwork project, Certeau used methods of quantitative and qualitative social research in a very unorthodox way, focusing on participant observation of everyday life at popular places, like, for example, the neighborhood La Croix-Rousse à Lyon, a former working-class district, which is a fancy artist and hipster quarter today. This ethnographical approach might brought to light the, I quote, creative heterogeneity of social practices, reusings, repurposings, reappropriations of the urban space. This, Certeau, dispersed tactical and tinkering creativity, which turned simple powerless consumers into powerful co-producing prosumers, inspired his most famous book, Practices of Everyday Life, French Art de Faire. This book established his international fame as one of the founding fathers of cultural studies. I quote, "People reappropriate the space. They use a multitude of tactics. We want to bring light to the clandestine forms taken by this creativity of groups and individuals. These procedures of consumers compose the network of an anti-discipline." And he writes this some years after the book of Michel Foucault. One can follow the swarming activity of these procedures, still Certeau, that far from being regulated by panoptic administration, have insinuated themselves into the networks of surveillance. I would like to trace few of these multiform, resistant, tricky, and stubborn procedures that elude discipline without being outside the field in which it is exercised. End of quotation. For its participants, Certeau's seminar at Paris 7 was the same. An unforgettable experience of subversive micropolitics of knowledge. An introduction into a tactical use of theories within the strategies of a predominant discourse. François Doss reports that there was a wind of freedom blowing in these seminars. And Lucia remembers, everything took place in a climate of intellectual liberty. No orthodoxy dominated, no dogma was imposed. The only implicit but strong rule was the desire of elucidation and an interest of exploring the concrete life. In miraculous moments, an air of intelligence floated through our works, a form of serenity which I never experienced in an institution of knowledge before. Everybody was welcomed with the same intensity of listening. This didactic performativity is remarkable. To put it into recent ecclesial terms, no epistemic clericalism, in the sense of the professor knows everything, he or she teaches without learning, but a kind of synodal epistemics, in the sense of a shared way, a synodos, of equal searchers and learners. Concerning this epistemic form of a synodal style of doing cultural anthropology, Certeau characterized his approach as zigzag, oscillating between the history of what we have already done and the utopia of what is still to be done. Both of these also characterize practical theology. It also oscillates between practical field research and discursive archive distance, or, as Certeau puts it in What is a Seminar? In our research group, everyone's actual field practices take place outside the Université Paris 7. In the university, however, encounters can take place regularly that are able to create a distance, an écart, in relation to the different places from which we come and where we work. In other words, the seminar can produce ways of distancing ourselves from our tasks and, at the same time, ways of returning to them in a changed manner. Autrement. Cultural anthropology, as well as practical theology, require both thick description and critical distance, because, I quote, "This play of places and about places opens up a critical space. This has a twofold condition of its own possibility. A, the practice of the group must be determined by the elaboration of its external contexts, that's the ethnographic part. B, but it also has the function of a critical distance. The discourses of the group are characterized by the fact that they are separated from the practices that we analyze with each other. And that is the theory part." End of quotation. There is only a gradual difference between the production of knowledge at universities and in society. Long before the sociological discourse discovered and conceived practice theories, Certeau aimed to, I quote, "give theoretical shape to everyday practices." Comment penser notre pratique? That's why he criticized the separation of academic theory at the one and social practices on the other side. It's maybe close to your refusion of the separation of mystical discourse and theological discourse. Certeau aimed to, I quote, at the very same time, from 1975 until 1977, Bruno Latour and Steve Woolger conducted their groundbreaking field research in a Californian laboratory by which they showed the constitutive influence of social practices on scientific work. 1979, they published their results in Laboratory Life, The Construction of Scientific Facts. In order to understand this important book, one can read Certeau's following lines from Casquin Seminaire. "The practices of our analysis leave behind the artificial boundary between the practices of a seminar and practices that are excluded from it, like eating, drinking, arguing from personal history behind the research, experiencing a local network in which an investigation is inscribed, and so on. They enable a reciprocal elucidation of our ways of studying and the ways of practice that we study. Theoretical work must attack the division between what academic is and what not. This project implies a play in a variety of locations. The periodic climb up of a university staircase represents only one punctuation in the text of our social activities. My second step, Certeau's toolbox. Michel de Certeau was a master of Ignatian dialectics, based on very useful distinctions, not only for the spiritual life, but also for theological research. Some of his theoretical distinctions are perfect tools for doing practical theology. I just single out 3 of them, which are connected to his text on the seminar. First, strategies and tactics. Certeau distinguishes strategies from tactics. I already mentioned it. In Casquin Seminaire, he writes, "I have called tactics ways of subverting the rules imposed by a dominant system. I distinguish them from strategies that are determined by the ability to form an autonomous locus of power. Our concern was to analyze these tactics. They constitute the vast majority of social practices. the creativity of consumers who are unrecognized poets and artists. The relationship of this type of pranking to the system within which it develops. The function of these tactics, which can be seen as an operational articulation between systems and bodies. All these questions form the babel of voices, le brouhaha, of our cactuar. So I skip a little, you know about these distinctions, I'm quite sure, to be in time at the end. I just want to show you one book of a German cultural theorist, because Michel de Certeau is very keen on these reappropriations that create a space propre without creating a safe and stable property. Academic solidarities with these practices constitute a kind of complicity. And the German cultural theorist Gesa Ziemer turned this into a fascinating concept, Komplizenschaft. Cultural anthropology and practical theology can be discursive allies of subaltern and marginalized tactics. Even more, in a kind of performative experience of discourse, Certeau's own seminar, as altered and decentered as it was forced to act tactically with respect to powerful and predominant discursive strategies in the French academic topography. I quote, "The seminar does not constitute a place of its own, un lieu propre. The seminar journeys outside Parisette, and so we find ourselves in various places. These escapes not only allow more concrete experiences and freer exchanges, they also break the seductive fiction of a place of one's own, a lieu propre." From Parisette to New York. Next station, World Trade Center. The 110th floor was a place where Michel de Certeau's distinction of strategies and tactics became concrete in two types of looking down at the skyscrapers and the streets of Manhattan. This fascinating view creates a certain type of knowledge. Certeau asks, to what erotics of knowledge does the ecstasy of reading such a cosmos belong? I wonder what is the source of this pleasure of seeing the whole, of looking down. When one goes up there, he leaves behind the mass. His evaluation transfigures him into a voyeur, a city watcher from above. It transforms the world into a text that lies before one's eyes. It allows one to be a solar eye, looking down like a god. End of quotation. This totalizing, god-like, top-down view of an, I quote, all-seeing power is embodied by Le Corbusier's divine hand of modern architecture. But there is an alternative, the bottom-up view of everyday urban practices. Certeau. The ordinary practitioners of the city live down below. They are walkers, mystically spoken, Wandersmänner or Wandersfrauen, whose bodies follow the urban text, the right without being able to read it. The networks of these writings compose a manifold story shaped out of the fragments of trajectories and alterations of spaces. So at the end, there are two ways of doing cultural anthropology and doing theology or practical theology, in the way of a watcher from above or of a wanderer below in the streets. Il y a deux possibilités, le voyeur ou le voyageur. It's only two letters which mark a big difference. And just as a kind of shift into another discourse, into the urbanist discourse of 20th century in US. Louis Mumford and Jane Jacobs, they stand for this different type of looking at a city, from below and from above. Or like Richard Sennett puts it in the French distinction of ville and cité. La ville, it's the city built of stones, and the cité, it's the city built of social dynamics. And he says, Mumford was very good in building up the city of stones, the cité. And Jane Jacobs was very good in building up the city of social dynamics. And Certeau was both. He had this view from above, le voyeur, but he was mainly the voyageur, walking the small paths of the city jungle of New York and other mega cities of our world. So again, I skip and come, how many? Still 5 minutes? Okay. To come to my next distinction, it's maps and tours. And yeah, let me go back to the text. Certeau's seminar was a place for theoretically mapping the social. Ethnographic tours within the urban space were followed by distant reconstructions of these participant observations, enriched by theories from academic discourse. This theoretic mapping of social practices was tactical because it aimed to change the traditional maps of knowledge by adding the everyday practices of popular culture as new discursive authorities. And here comes into play Certeau's distinction between maps and tours. That means between everyday itineraries and academic conceptualizations. Again, I quote from the practices of everyday life. In narrations, tours are dominant. Examples of tours are conditioning a map. But there are also cases in which a tour assumes the indication of a place. We thus have the structure of a travel story. Stories of journeys are marked out by the citation of the places that result from them or authorize them. Within the shift to modern academic discourse, these narrative descriptions of journeys became dominated by theoretical mappings. And I quote Certeau, erasure of the itineraries and their describers happened. And this also happened in theological discourse. Certeau, between the 15th and the 17th centuries, the map became autonomous. And also the map of the Loci Theologici, like the topography of theology, became autonomous. The map colonizes the space. It eliminates the practices that produce it. The map pushes away the operations of which it is the result or the necessary condition. It remains alone on the stage. The tour describers have disappeared. And same things can happen in theology. When we only have the maps of systematic theology and these describers and the itineraries which made it being produced disappear. And that's why we need new approaches in theology that take the everyday practices of popular culture as a new locus theologicus, as a theological authority of discourse. Like what is called in English ordinary theology or citizen theology, or in German discourse Leutetheologie, people's or popular theology, or Alltagsdogmatik, everyday dogmatics, la sagesse du peuple, or the Idiota in Surin's letter. People, Leute, live in their everyday practices a tactical, subversive countermapping of theology. I collaborate with geographers, and they introduced to me in the practices of countermapping. And we need practices of countermapping in theology too, a kind of critical mapping, a kind of mapping back. Welcome to a synodal church. So I come to my end. It's only a short paragraph. Denkformen of alterity. Keeping the discourse open. Concluding these reflections, let me return to the beginning, where I claimed Certeau to be a hidden practical theologian. As a proof for this, I mentioned the double approach of exploring both archives of mystical discourse and fields of contemporary practices. Both are, as he writes in his text on the World Trade Center, populated by wanderers. Our fellow contemporaneans, anonymous Christian mystics. In any case, they embody Certeau's characteristic difference of Christian mysticism and everyday life. His scientific curiosity that reached, I quote Louis Vuitton, from the mystics and possessed of the 17th century to the inhabitants of our new cities in 1975. And these two sides of his discourse, which describes Denis Pelletier, create different communities of reception. Louis Vuitton, each of his parts of his research, dedicated at the one time to the language of mystical texts and at the other to the art of practice of everyday life, found interest of specialists, but without seeing the deeper coherence. Nevertheless, there is unity in it. And this missing unity consists in his heterological approach. Certeau stands for an empirically rich heterology of the other in past and present discourses and practices. He calls history, psychoanalysis, and ethnography, his favorite academic disciplines, sciences of the other. Of the past as the historical other, of the unconscious as the psychological other, and of the foreign as the cultural other. All these discursive alterities of Certeau's widespread heterological work converge into a theology that is a discourse on the very other. This heterological decentration of discourse requires a dismantling of epistemic truth claims in favor of a pluralistic model of theology that reckons with a Deo semper maior not only in spiritual practices, but also in his own epistemological core discourse, touched by the untouchable. Michel de Certeau has an attractive theoretical offer for this. I call it the 3 steps of alterity, or an alteritanian 3-step, distilled from his posthumously published theological masterpiece, La faiblesse de croire. First step, I miss the others. Il me manque. Second, nothing is possible without the others. Sont pas. Third, neither you nor I have the full truth. Ni. Academic discourse and everyday practices should be understood neither in the sense of a pre-modern either-or, nor in the sense of a post-modern both-and, but rather in the sense of a late modern or radical modern neither-nor. A double negation which keeps the Christian archives of discourse permanently open to the field of practices and the other way around. Because it is not possible without the others, not without their everyday lives, and not without a critical distance. Nothing more is needed for doing good practical theology. Thanks for your attention.